Hello, my name is Steve Akley, and this is the store I co-own with my business partner Jim Fosnot in St. Louis, Missouri. I am a lifelong bourbon fan that has been on the periphery of the bourbon industry since writing a book about bourbon distilleries back in 2015. Since that book, I've written several others, been a blogger, a podcaster, and filmmaker all about bourbon. I truly love every aspect of bourbon, from the people, brands, and distilleries, and even to its rich history that is interwoven with American history. One unusual fascination that I have that may differ a lot from other bourbon fans is the Kentucky Bourbon Hall-of-Fame. I love the idea that a person can dedicate his or her life to the industry and then gain immortality through the recognition of this special entity, meaning in perpetuity, bourbon fans will never forget their unique contributions. As I scroll through the roster of inductees, I can't help but see one glaring omission. So what I discovered recently as I look at this new bottle of Jim Beam, you can see on the side label it has all of the distillers, including Fred No, the current master distiller of Jim Beam. Freddie No's not on there yet. At some point he will be on there as well. But as you go back to this bottle that I found, it ends up being a little bit older. It's about 25 years old. And this one, the latest distiller that's listed on this one is Booker No. And of course, in between was Jerry Dalton. And it just got me to thinking, why is Jerry Dalton not on the label? And, maybe it's just because of the fact it's just family members. And I get that. I understand for marketing purposes that might be okay. But the thing that really had me puzzled was the fact he's not in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall-of-Fame. Jerry Dalton was, he served Jim Beam for 9 years. And these were very important years for Beam. This was years when they were under, strategic growth. And he was an innovator. He, invented products that the bourbon industry had never seen before. He made bourbon with like soft winter wheat. He also did something with brown rice. And there was like 3 other experiments that he did, things that just weren't done. We would see the craft industry doing that later, but it would be a solid 25 years after the fact, after Jerry was doing this, that we saw the craft industry kind of catch on to that. And now what's funny is we see Heritage Bourbon doing that as well. So very interesting thing, the fact that Jerry isn't in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame. For me, that should be the capstone of any career. And somebody who's done as much as he has deserves to be in there. And you know what? I happen to know Jerry Dalton. He's coming on my podcast before. And I got to thinking about the fact that he's not in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame. I'd like to ask him about it. I telephoned him recently. He said he'd be willing to talk to me. So you know what I need to do? I need to head down to Kentucky and talk to Jerry. So I made the journey from St. Louis to Louisville, and we are right here at Jerry Dalton's place right now, and going to knock on the door, and hopefully he'll answer and talk to us. So here we go.
Wow, Steve.
Hey, Jerry, how you doing?
Doing fine.
Good. Look forward to talking to you. Yeah, that'll be great. Right. Jerry and I would sit down with a no-question off-limit interview about his time in the bourbon industry. Here we are with Jerry Dalton. Jerry, how are you?
Doing fine, Steve.
Good. Very much looking forward to this. So if you don't mind, the first thing that I would like to ask you about is just tell us a little bit about yourself outside of the industry. Just a little bit like, who is Jerry Dalton?
Well, I've asked myself that many times, but just background, I was born in actually California, but I grew up in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and I started driving nails for my old man, believe it or not, when I was 11 years old. He was a carpenter contractor. And so I can legitimately say I started working for a living when I was 11, which is probably a violation of some labor law, but nonetheless.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Went to high school in Consolidated County High School in Bowling Green. I suppose if I'm going to blow my own horn a little bit, I was valedictorian of my graduating class. I had a 4-point average, and I was also a semifinalist in National Merit Scholarship awards. I went from there to Western Kentucky College, where my academic career was not quite so distinguished, but nonetheless, I came out of there after 4 years married to my beautiful wife, Judy, and had a BS in chemistry and mathematics, which both appealed to me. Went to graduate school at the University of Louisville, so I'm a Kentucky product through and through when it comes to academics. I graduated at U of L with a PhD in physical chemistry. In that same period of time, enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve and did a increment at Quantico, Virginia, in Marine Corps schools, which was my boot camp. I finished up my military obligation a year before I got my degree. Otherwise, I probably would have been the only PhD PFC in the entire Marine Corps, but I don't think they really counted on any of those academic skills that much. From there, I meandered through a number of different jobs. I worked in coatings, I worked in electronics, ended up in Eastern Kentucky. Emphasis there is on we came back to Kentucky from South Carolina, and I opened and ran an environmental lab there in Eastern Kentucky for a few years, and realized Judy and I both were working long hours, and I didn't know if I could physically keep it up. So I started looking for a job, and the job I found was chief chemist at Barton Brands. So I hired in there, and that's what put me in the bourbon business.
So was there any foreshadowing of this, Jerry? Because sometimes I like to say when you grow up, there's bourbon households and there's non-bourbon households. Like in my household, my parents didn't drink a lot, but when they did, they preferred bourbon cocktails. They weren't bourbon neat drinkers or on the rocks or anything like that, but they liked cocktails made with bourbon. Did you grow up in Kentucky in a bourbon household, or was it something that really wasn't even part of your childhood?
Oh no, the standard in my household when I grew up was what was referred to as a highball, and all that was bourbon and whatever cola happened to be handy. We also had at Christmas time there was eggnog, and that was always spiked. So it was not an alien concept. I might also add that I was involved in the business when I didn't even know what the business was. My grandparents had a farm, and I remember they sold stave timber, and that's all I knew. Stave timber had to be a log 8 feet long and no knots, and I didn't really comprehend what stave timber was, but ultimately it was going to end up being whiskey barrels. So I had an acquaintance with that part of the business, if it was long distance. And then I might add, in those hills and hollers down there where my grandparents lived, I'm confident that there was some activity going on the side. And so all in all, I can say I grew up in a household where bourbon and near bourbon were natural concepts.
So you go to work for Barton Brands. Was this something that you were seeking out, like this might be a company I'd like to work for, or was it just an opportunity where there was a job opening and you applied for it and you got it? You might have very well ended up at a different place, in a different industry even.
Well, the real reason we were living in Somerset, Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky, and one of the driving forces was my wife's family was largely from Louisville, and especially her mother, who was getting on in years, lived here in Valley Station. So one of the principal drivers was getting closer to Louisville than we were. So I put the resume out, and Martin Brown's happened at the same time. Their chief chemist was an elderly man, and he was going to retire. So it just, I tell people, even a blind hog finds an acorn. Well, this blind hog found that particular acorn, and I went to work for Martin Brown's.
And what specifically was your role at Barton? What were you doing there?
I was flailing about initially because I didn't know anything about the business. So I strolled into a situation where there had been a benign neglect for years. As the old fellow who had retired got older, he'd gotten to where he wasn't really keeping up with things. And so my first stab at Barton was just finding methods, standard methods of analysis, serial chemist standard methods, those sorts of things, and putting them in place. Plus, there was an industry-wide technical problem that the Kentucky Distillers Association was working on for the whole business. So I tackled that and at Barton and figured some things out, and was able to establish myself in the industry as somebody who was at least pretty well acquainted with the lab.
Who were some of your contemporaries there? Who were some of the people you were working with?
Well, when I went in, and as I said, this particular problem was industry-wide. When I went in, I remember spending several days crawling around in the top of the old Heaven Hill distillery with Parker Beam. I immediately had contact with, of course, Booker was still active at that point in operations, and I had the good fortune to literally live in Booker's backyard in the house we were renting. So I immediately made acquaintance with Booker and started working with him, to the point that he would bring samples home from work and pass them over to me, and I would run them, and running the test required some preparation, so it took like 36 hours from when the sample made it to the lab to when I had a result. So 2 days later, Booker would be out there in the backyard waiting, and I'd show up from work, and he would ask about the results, and I'd give them to him, and this stuck in my mind. Booker would dig around and come out with his billfold, and he'd open it up, and he had a little piece of paper in there, and he'd pull out the little piece of paper, and he'd write things down on it and put them back in his billfold. And I'm sure he took those to technical meetings at Beam.
This is crazy that you're working for Barton, he's working for Beam, and you're doing some lab work and stuff for him.
Well,
it's just great.
You got to realize that was, at that time, there were only like 9 active companies.
Mm-hmm.
These days, I have no idea. There's probably 200 distilleries running legally in Kentucky, but back then there weren't that many of us.
How long did you work for Barton?
How long? Right at 10 years.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about the friendship with Booker now, because he's one of the characters from the industry for sure.
Oh, yeah. First and foremost, let me say, it was one of the greatest strokes of luck and greatest experience. My and Judy's interaction with the Beams and the Nose, especially Booker and Annis, Fred and Sandy, they epitomize Southern hospitality, and they took us under their wing like neighbors that had lived there all their lives, and we always had, I think, an outstanding interaction with them.
You know, and again, he is truly one of the legends of the industry for sure. One of the guys that will be in the kind of the discussion of the Mount Rushmore bourbon. He's in the mix. I don't know whether he's in that four that would go on the Mount Rushmore bourbon or not, but you got to talk about him for sure. So people love the stories, and again, there's just not a lot of people anymore that have these firsthand accounts. Is there any story that you can share with this audience that of a personal interaction with Booker that just stands out with you as something that would be interesting?
Well, there's one which I'm sure you heard before, but the whiskey writers who came down and they were doing a book on bourbon, and they had been up to see Jimmy Russell, and they let it be known that they were going to come see me and then go see Booker. And Jimmy lit up when they said that we were going to go see Booker, and Jimmy told the two writers to tell Booker he didn't know jack shit about making whiskey. And so these guys came and they spent a day with me, and we talked, and right before they left, one of them said, you know, Jimmy Russell told us to say that to Booker. What do you think? And I said, well, I think he will get a big laugh out of it, and really appreciate it. Well, they departed. Next stop was going to be Booker's kitchen. And before the dust settled in the parking lot, I had Booker on the phone. I said, Booker, they're going to tell you don't know jack about making bourbon. He said, should I laugh or should I roar? And I said, roar. Roar he did. And I'm told that a couple of people nearly fainted, but when they finally got told that they'd been had, well, they thought it was pretty funny too. In fact, they wrote it into the introduction to the book.
So how do you ultimately go to work for Jim Beam then?
Well, as I said, truth is I was working for Jim Beam before I ever got on their payroll, but I decided to part ways with Barton, and it came open immediately, the distillery manager's job at the Boston Distillery, Boston, Kentucky, of course. And it's an interesting note. The executive vice president of operations at Beam, I had gone with my boss then to a meeting at Bill Samuel's house, and it was a KDA type meeting. And this vice president was there, and he and I knew each other already. So we're standing over in the corner just shooting the breeze, and my boss came walking up, and just as he walked up, the VP says, well, Jerry, it's really been nice interviewing you, and I'll let you know. And I'm going, ruh-roh. And as it turned out, it was prophetic, because a couple of years later, he actually participated in hiring me.
What was your favorite part of, your job at Jim Beam at that time? What did you enjoy?
Oh, at that time, because at that time I was the distillery manager, I enjoyed digging out data, everything I could get my hands on, and they had generated a lot of data over the years. So I'm a numbers dweeb, that's all there is to it. So I spent a lot of time reviewing data and making sure I understood what normal variations in balling of a mash or yeast cell count. I made sure I knew what was normal, because that way I knew when something was going off rails, so to speak. So I spent a lot of time. I still had to worry about, did everybody show up and were they all working at their job? And I had to worry about, did the grain come, or is it coming, or is it going to be late? What's going to happen? I had all those day-to-day lights on things that I had to worry about, but I also spent a lot of time analyzing data and making sure I understood what that distillery was really doing.
So take us through your appointment of the role of Master Distiller. How does this come about? When did you first think that something like this might happen? How do they present this to you? And what was the process you had to go through to get the job? And then take us through the moment you found out.
Well, I wrote a letter. I don't often write letters to management, but I wrote a letter to my boss, and basically I pointed out that they had an HR department that wrote herd on people. They had accountants who worried all day long every day about costs and expenditures. They had an engineering department that made sure pumps pumped and valves opened, but they didn't have anybody watching the process. And I told them I wanted to watch the process, and I said in the letter, I want to be Master Distiller. And I gave it to my boss, took a deep breath and went and hid because I had no idea what might happen. Nothing for a while. And then one day I got a call to come to the front office. Well, to back up a little bit, my boss had showed it to his boss, who was at that time the plant manager, who showed it to his boss, who was that executive VP of operations. And then somebody took it over and showed it to Booker. And I got called to the front office. I walked in, and here sits everybody but Booker. He was by then semi-retired. And all these people are sitting there, and I'm going, this could be very good or it could be very bad. Well, it turned out to be very good. They told me I was being promoted to Master Distiller, and they at that time knew that I had a lock-on process. I knew technically what I needed to know to do that job, and they told me that I would immediately start getting trained in PR work, which I'd have to do a certain amount of as Master Distiller. So I literally got told out of the blue that I was going to be Master Distiller. I said, wow.
Tell us about the job itself. What was it like being the Master Distiller being?
Amazing. If this was not for public consumption, I would have said some kind of expletive in the front of that I'm not allowed to say. But it was amazing. It was surreal. I never, ever anticipated in all the years that I'd worked at that point, I never anticipated having a job like that. Again, I don't like to blow my own horn, so to speak, but my goodness, I was going to be the Master Distiller for the '1 bourbon producer in the country and the world. And so I took it seriously. I went places I never thought I would go. Traveled to Scotland, Spain, several trips to Mexico. I talked with people that I never anticipated talking to, and I talked to some of the technical people at other distilleries and continued to exchange ideas with them.
You were also involved in the project to resurrect the George Washington Distillery at Mount Vernon. Tell us about that.
Well, that Jim Beam is a member of the Distilled Spirits Council of America, DISCUS, and because of that, the DISCUS members were all involved. They had uncovered the foundations of the George Washington Distillery. It was right near the grist mill there at Mount Vernon. And the historical folks up there wanted to restore it. And DISCUS wanted to be involved. So that sort of put Jim Beam in there in the mix, obviously. So a lot of work went on, and it was decided that we were going to build replica of as much as possible, of the George Washington Distillery. So Vendome here in Louisville does all kinds of work, but they went literally to the Smithsonian, and there was an alembic there, a pot still, and it had 1787 stamped on the handle, and that was from Washington's era. Vendome took measurements and built an exact replica of that, which was going to be the first still in the restored Washington Distillery. Well, I piped in at one of the meetings and said, it might be a good idea to make a run with this thing before we go putting it in an enclosed structure. And so everybody agreed. Chris Morris up at Brown-Forman mashed some mash and they deduced a mash bill from the grain receipts at the distillery. It turned out it was rye whiskey, but nonetheless, Chris fermented mash and put it in a 55-gallon drum and sent it down to me, and Vendome brought the still and a converted wood-burning stove as a firebox. So we plopped it still down on top of that firebox, charged her up with some of that fermented mash, and lit her off. Mike Sherman of Vendome and I, we were out there under a sycamore tree, far from anything else that we could burn down, and we cooked the thing up and successfully ran off what I referred to as probably 2 proof gallons of the costliest rye whiskey that's ever been made, when you considered the pay that went into the people who worked on it.
You would ultimately leave Jim Beam and then disappear largely from the public spotlight. Tell us a little bit about your life after leaving Beam.
Well, as I said, I started working literally as a kid, 11 years old. I worked as an undergraduate. I graduated in 4 years, but actually I laid out one entire semester of that, working and courting Judy and getting married. And I also worked in that period of time, roughly on average 25 hours a week. And you may have noticed I'm a bit of a large person, and I was a natural for warehouse crews. So I worked on a warehouse crew for the entire time I was an undergraduate, first for Sears and then for a local moving company. Point is, I worked. I went to graduate school, and I was a teaching assistant there. So I was working teaching labs. Then I got out and I worked, And after 40 odd years of working, I was tired. I wanted to retire. And so we retired. I retired. Judy had retired earlier. And we moved to Statesville, North Carolina, where my daughter was at that time, to be close to her for a while. And I never really removed myself from the bourbon industry, because in that time period, I had 2 little papers published in Malt Advocate, my experiences at bourbon. I wrote a chapter in a book called Whiskey and Philosophy, called Heisenberg's Spirits, and I wrote a number of other small things for like the Bourbon Country Reader and that sort of thing. So I managed to do my hobby of writing and also play on my experience in the bourbon industry. So I never really quite totally disappeared. I just maintained what's known as a low profile for a while. Then unfortunately, about midway through all that, we discovered that Judy had a heart condition, well, 2, coronary artery disease and congestive heart failure. And she also had the beginnings of dementia. And so the last few years of that 15 years that I was not obvious. I was taking care of her.
Yeah, amazing. You were a visionary at Jim Beam, really for the industry. Your work with alternative grains would be something that we see large scale in the industry today, and it's often attributed to the craft movement. That as these little distilleries popped up, that one way that they could differentiate themselves from the big companies like Beam is they would use alternative grains. But when you were there, you were doing all that kind of stuff and experiments like that long before there was even craft distilleries. So tell us a little bit about your work with some of those alternative grains.
Well, it's said that people who steal ideas from other people are plagiarists, and people who steal ideas from groups of people are doing research. But I was doing research, and part of my research was I actually got sent to Scotland to train the local sales force there in bourbon and bourbon history, because they were fighting an uphill battle trying to sell bourbon in the country that invented Scotch. So anyhow, while I was there in the off hours, we did a lot more of that QC that I was talking about. We did with Booker back home. We did some QC on Scotch, and among other things, I was amazed to discover how broad a spectrum of organoleptic properties were available in Scotch. I had this mindset that it was this sort of smoky stuff, and I liked it, but I didn't think there was much variation. Wrong-o. There, I drank Scotch that, in my ignorance, I never would have known was Scotch there. My point being that the blended Scotch whiskeys, I'm told, might have upwards of 30 single malts in them, blended together by a master blender. And I got to thinking about bourbon. I thought, well, we make bourbon with corn, and we make rye for the smaller grain and throw in some malt to get the whole thing going. And that's it. And I said, maybe if we substituted other grains, because all it has to be is a fermented mash of grain to be whiskey, 51% corn to be bourbon. I said, maybe if we used other small grains, we could produce whiskeys with enough difference from one to the other to give ourselves some of that blending latitude that the Scotch people had all along. And so that was the basic idea. I formulated 6 mash bills, each of which qualified standalone as a bourbon because they had 51% corn in them, but each one of which had a different small grain. One not so different, the one with the rye in it just had more rye than normally you would see in a bourbon mash bill.
And just so people know, we're talking 6 different grains: soft red wheat, right? Brown rice, triticale. Mm-hmm. What else was there? 6-row barley.
I think you mentioned oats.
Whole rolled oats, yes. So, and a high rye. How did you decide those would be the ones that you wanted to experiment with?
Because they were readily available, if not necessarily for the whiskey industry, but they were out there and we could get our hands on them, and they were not so esoteric that the cost would make it prohibitive to make whiskey out of them. So I just chose those because those were the ones that made sense to me. I might also add, it's funny, you almost can't do anything without stepping on somebody's toes. And I had a call from somebody up in the corporate building who will not name, and he wanted to know what I thought I was doing with these mash bills and this strange whiskey, seeing samples come through, and he didn't approve of that, and I wouldn't be able to get them through him. And I pointed out that the idea had been bumped all the way up to the executive VP level, and if he had a problem with that, he'd have to talk with them. It was above my pay grade. I didn't hear any more from him after that.
As you reflect back on your time at Beam now, what are your thoughts on your career there?
I'm totally amazed. I truly am that I stumbled into it, and I'm not proud. I'll tell you, I never had any notion of oh, I'm going to be a master distiller. All I wanted to do was find a job that paid enough to get by on, and the fact that I found my way into the whiskey business was an amazing happenstance, and probably a better break than I ever deserved. My whole career in the whiskey business has been, for me, a constant surprise. I walk in the door and I go, oh, gee, I never anticipated this. Like I said, my lengthy comment when I got appointed Master Distiller was, wow, I was amazed. So the whole thing was amazing. I don't know how else to describe it. And I was fortunate beyond belief to not only have gotten into the industry, but to become neighbors, friends, and business associates with Booker and Fred. Was just a blessing. Like I said, more than I ever deserved.
Absolutely. For me, the Kentucky Bourbon Hall-of-Fame, the closest thing I can make it akin to is sports Hall of Fames. And as I think about what is a sports Hall of Fame, what qualifies you for that, I have to feel like, as I look at your career, every box would be ticked in terms of qualifications. I mean, you look at, you were employed by the largest bourbon distillery in the world. You served as master distiller of that organization for 9 years during growth years, certainly at a time when they very much needed you. You had a long career in the industry. Sometimes that plays into it. Were you in the 20 years in the industry? Who were your contemporaries? And you certainly have a pedigree of contemporaries there. Did you contribute to the industry? Well, you look at those products that you made in terms of working with those alternative grains. Did you extend that? And then your work at the Washington distillery. There's a lot there. There's an incredible case that could be made to get you into the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame. What would that honor mean to you?
Well, it would be a great honor. That's what it's intended to be, is an honor. And I would consider it a great honor just to be associated with the other people who are already in the Bourbon Hall of Fame. But for me personally, in my own mind, for the way I define things that deserve honors, I got a PhD, and the reason I have it is because in a small corner of the academic world, I advanced the knowledge. And for me to get into the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame, for me personally, it would be a statement that I had advanced the art and science of distilling. I had made that kind of contribution, and that's the way I would take it, and it would be truly an honor.
Jerry, as you look back on your time in the bourbon industry, are these positive memories or are they negative?
It's wildly positive. The whole experience, I was a stranger in a strange land. I was wandering through uncharted territory because I wasn't used to being, hesitate to say it, but for a while there, I was a rock star. I've had people in the Beam House from Australia mob me, wanting to get their picture made with me. So that was just a totally alien concept to me. All I wanted to do was have my head down and do the best I possibly could with what I had to work with. So the whole thing was a positive. I loved the PR part of it. I enjoyed making presentations and doing tastings, thought it was wonderful, but I also had just as good a time walking around in a noisy, hot room, listening to pumps and seeing if they sounded like they were okay or if there was a bearing clicking in there somewhere. So the whole thing from beginning to end, the hot, sweaty part and the cool, air-conditioned tastings, every bit of it was a vast positive for me. I can't say enough about it. I'm profoundly grateful for it.
Let's have a drink. We want to.
Yeah,
let's.
I'm all for that, but I would like to say one thing.
Okay.
To the people that I hold dear in the bourbon business and the fans, I would like to say best wishes, good spirits, and may you never thirst.
Absolutely.
Let's have a drink.
Let's have a drink. Cheers, buddy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers to you.
A glass of bourbon with the legend, Jerry Dalton. Jerry, let's enjoy this one, and let's have another one when you get in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall-of-Fame. How's that sound?
All right.
Let's do that. Let's plan on that. Thanks, everyone. After our interview, I had several takeaways. First, it truly is a travesty Jerry isn't in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall-of-Fame already. He clearly had a career in which you can see he was a key contributor to the industry while working at a high level in it for over 20 years. My second takeaway was the only thing that exceeds Jerry's love for the industry and Jim Beam, the brand he so proudly ran for 9 years, was the love of his life, his wife Judy, who passed away in October of 2022. This interaction has motivated me even more to press for Jerry's inclusion into this very special place of honor and to do so while he is living and can enjoy it. I decided the next step would be to talk to some of the key players, past and present, from the bourbon industry to get their take on Jerry's career and see if they agree he deserves the distinction of being a member of the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame.
I'm Chuck Cowdery. I don't know much else about who I am than that. I write about lots of stuff, but mostly whiskey.
So Chuck, and certainly you have a long history with Jim Beam, and you were very close to the organization, certainly at a time when Jerry Dalton was there. So tell us a little bit about what you know about Jerry and his career at Jim Beam.
My main memories of him are from the work on the documentary, and one of the things that struck me was that he was, like I said, a PhD chemist and didn't have any prior background in the industry. So he relied quite a bit on the hands that they had there. And certainly this, we're talking about the early 90s now. But I remember him telling me that he said, I'll be going through the distillery and one of the hands will say, the bubbles don't seem to be breaking right in the fermenter, that kind of thing, that kind of just sort of offhand comment. And Jerry would take it seriously. He would take some samples and go into the lab, and sure enough, he'd find something that wasn't quite right. And, so that he really relied a lot on that, on that experience, on that culture.
My name is Jill Hawkins. Currently, I'm just a retired person, but I do have a history in the industry. Most recently, I ran the Kentucky Bourbon Festival.
So tell us a little bit about, as a Kentucky resident and someone who's part of the industry, tell us a little bit about what you know about Jerry Dalton.
Jerry was a chemist. He started as a chemist with Beam, and then rose to the ranks of Master Distiller, which was interesting because he certainly had the pedigree and the training to be a Master Distiller, but he was probably the only one in the Beam organization who didn't have the last name.
Yeah, and that's certainly a big part of his story. The only non-Beam family member to have that title of Master Distiller. That's pretty important by itself, isn't it?
I think it is, and I think it speaks to his skill because he's the only one. That man knows his stuff. He, in my humble opinion, he helped build the bourbon comeback. He produced liquid that drew the attention of so many in the early days when that segment of the industry was recovering from nobody drinks brown liquid. So I think Jerry's role in bourbon history is very important.
My name is Phil Collin, and I'm the founder of a bourbon adventure company called Phil Talks Whiskey.
All right, tell us a little bit about Jerry Dalton. What do you know about his career?
Yeah, he steered a massive ship for a number of years, no small feat. And, the bourbon industry's grown so much, but it's important to remember that Beam has always been the big dog. And I don't have the numbers, but I'm confident that at the time when he was in charge, they were distilling and laying down more barrels a day than any other distillery in the state. So it's a huge role.
If you're going to start building a case to be in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall-of-Fame, I mean, another thing that he did to really raise the profile of the industry was he was involved in the project to bring back distilling at Mount Vernon, George Washington's own distillery. In fact, they at the Smithsonian, they had the original still that Washington used. Now he wasn't necessarily the distiller, but under the time when Washington was making whiskey, this was the still that they used, and Vendôme's job was to copy that still, and that's what they would then place into Mount Vernon. But Jerry came up with the idea of, we can't really copy this without not knowing it works. We need to do a run on it. So they did a run. Jerry did that himself. The first person to make a run under the new Mount Vernon was Jerry. And that's something that's pretty big for the industry, isn't it?
Yeah, that story and a lot of the stories like it really always solidifies Jerry Dalton in my mind in the same company. Dave Pickrell and Lincoln Henderson. It reminds me a lot of that group. He's kind of the total package, PhD in chemical engineering, family has a long history of distilling, and he's got all of the passion and none of the ego. And it always seems that he's willing to go around and lend his knowledge to other projects like Mount Vernon or what have you, to get something even a little better than it was before he stepped in. So I think that those three names should be bundled together a lot more because they had similar paths, similar experience, and similar impact in different ways throughout the industry. We talked about what an achievement it is just running a distillery that big. And in an era we are right now where bottles or release specific expressions and releases are being named after people left and right, real and fictitious, I think he should at least have a Beam bottle out there that's put out to the public with a name on it. If we can have a James T. Kirk bourbon out there, we can certainly have a Jerry Dalton bourbon bottle out there.
Andrew Weebrink, Director of Research and Innovation for Independent Stave Company.
All right, we're here talking today about Mr. Jerry Dalton. What do you know about Jerry Dalton and his career?
I know what he's done with the industry, and he was, kind of one of those original OGs before the Master Distillers, before really, Master Distillers. And those are some people that, I think really had a firm grasp on what made bourbon and kind of what made the wheels go round in this industry. As far as, I'm not going to say I'm a Jerry Dalton connoisseur expert, but, I'm aware that he was an important figure in the industry before, it kind of became, the end thing, before bourbon was cool.
And you certainly get to see behind the scenes and a little bit different approach to the industry than most people. You work with so many of the master distillers of the big brands and things like that. And that's a big job. Now, Jerry had the job of master distiller for Jim Beam for 9 years. He worked there 12 years in total, but 9 of it which he actually had the title of master distiller. And that's a big job, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a big job. It still is in some instances, a really, really big job. But again, that was You know, when he did it, it was back in the day where the master distiller took on more aspects of really, you know, what most other industries would consider a plant manager. So think of like, you know, the Corvette plant here in Kentucky. It would be the, you know, the guy who oversees that entire operation. You know, those are kind of the master distillers of back in the day. They weren't really thought of as, you know, kind of the rock stars they were. They just had a big job to do. You know, not a lot of recognition, but they got it done.
My name is Dixie Hibbs, and I am a local historian for Nelson County, Kentucky.
All right, so we're talking about Jerry Dalton and his role in the bourbon industry. Tell us a little bit about what you know about Jerry Dalton.
Well, I know my interaction with Jerry took place in the 1990s, and my interaction with Jerry was because he was the distiller at Beams. I would ask Beams for donations of whiskey when we would have Japanese visitors. Now, how does that all work? I'm a tour guide, and I hooked up with some Japanese visitors early on in the 90s who owned bourbon bars in Japan. And I drove them around Kentucky, and we ended up starting to have get-togethers when the bourbon festival would come along. I have a farm, and we would take them down to the farm. I'm talking like a busload. And we would have music and barbecue and bourbon. And so we asked Jerry one time, could he bring some Beams bourbon? We had Heaven Hill bourbon. We try to be, you know, equal here at least. And so he came down, and of course the Japanese loved to talk to anybody connected with bourbon. They thought Booker was a god, and Jerry was a distiller, so he could certainly talk about it. At the time he came, I don't think Booker was there. He had come occasionally, but the market in Japan was very good. And of course, all of our distillers are very aware of international markets, so they're good about that. But there were my brother-in-law worked at Beams, and I think he was the one who actually, Johnny Hibbs, I think he asked Jerry about the donation of whiskey and coming and all. But that was most of my contact with him. But there again, I think in conversation with you before, it is unusual that there would be a distiller at Beams Distillery that wasn't a member of the Beam family. So he, right off, people knew that he had to be a very successful he knew what he was doing, is what I guess I'm trying to say.
I'm Jim Rutledge. I was a former master distiller at the Four Roses for 22 or 23 years. I retired in 2015. I've stayed active in the bourbon business since then, doing consulting work, contract distillation, and working with other distillery startups.
Tell us a little bit about, because you worked at the same time Jerry Dalton did, so tell us a little bit about what you know about Jerry.
Well, I first met Jerry when he was a distiller at Barton Distillery. He was there for 2, maybe 3 years. I'm not sure, when he left Barton to go to Jim Beam. And we stayed in touch like most of us do during his time, both at Barton and at Jim Beam. Jerry did some work. I was on the board of directors of the Kentucky Distillers Association during that time. And he participated in some of the quarterly meetings and other functions of the KDA. He was always present with his wife, Judy, at all the events, distillers events, whether it be a tasting in which all of us were involved, or the Kentucky Bourbon Festival, things like that. His wife was by his side every event in which she would be invited.
And while the two of you never worked together for the same company or anything like that, as industry peers, there are times when you would help one another, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Jerry was the first I know of, and maybe ever. He had a PhD, and I'm not sure whether it was chemistry or microbiology. I think perhaps that was his PhD. And I remember one time he called me, he was still at Barton, and he called me with a fermentation problem he'd never seen. The way the fermenters were looking, we discussed it for quite a while, and I probably missed about half of what he was saying, because I'm thinking, Jerry, a PhD, and he's calling me to ask for what I, over time, we've all seen a little bit of everything. I can't remember the exact details of it, but yeah, we would help each other often like that.
Hunter Watson, founder of Rolling Fork Spirits.
So, what do you know about Jerry Dalton?
I know of his leadership at Jim Beam from 98 through I think 07.
Yes.
And, just a little bit about the man that he is and what he means to the spirits community. Jerry Dalton's a guy that it's almost like the bourbon gods picked him to be in this industry. Here's a guy with the chemistry and engineering degrees that just moves to Claremont, and he winds up being the neighbor of Booker No. Completely random. He didn't pick that. Here's the guy that built the first Amblix still that would be the first still to be recreated in BC. And he didn't manifest that. This is a man that has worked with Lincoln Henderson, Booker Beam, Dave Pickerel, Fred No, Jimmy Russell, Booker No, all these icons. He is a part of the relationship of who those people are. And I'm sure if we could ask any one of those individuals, they would tell us stories about Jerry Dalton for days. And he's the most unassuming character that I hope to meet one day. But this is an icon. It has led the path of Jim Beam through its really, really big uptick in production. Probably had a hand in developing the third shift, and didn't do it by need of wanting to do this. It just all kind of happened. And that just blows me away that he has such an impact on something that you and I love so dearly. And he just kind of did it by doing it.
I'm Luke Otero from Santa Fe, New Mexico, co-owner of Santa Fe Boutique Wines and Spirits.
So, and you are also a big-time bourbon fan, and of course, like many of us, kind of a hobbyist bourbon historian. And so tell us a little bit about what you know about Jerry Dalton.
Certainly, Steve. Being a bourbon fan for many, many years, when I like something, I like to know as much about it as possible. And like you and many others, my formidable years in college, I was drinking Jim Beam and loved it then, still do to this day. And Jerry's name got mentioned a few years ago, and I said, this has really piqued my interest because I always thought the lineage was, starting from, well, obviously before Booker, but Booker, then Fred, now Freddie, and the heir apparent. But what I didn't know was where Jerry Dalton fit in. And that piqued my interest to find out that in between Fred No and his dad Booker, Jerry was the master distiller. And those are very formidable years for the Beam distillery because, bourbon was still trying to find themselves. And he was, to me, as far as I'm concerned, he set the groundwork. He was the bridge that kept it all together for Jim Beam Distillery. And I had to admire that man and still do to this day.
You're talking about an individual with a 22-year career starting out at Barton Brands, the last 12 years of it, which was spent at Jim Beam, the last 9 years of his time at Jim Beam, he served as master distiller. You're talking about an individual that contributed by helping others in the industry, and that's notable, and that's something that's talked about quite a bit amongst others, his contemporaries from the industry. He contributed to the industry through science and working with Independent Stave on some things with the barrels. He also was the first person to ever run whiskey at the George Washington Distillery, which is certainly good for the industry as well. And he created a product called the Harvest Series that is part of Jim Beam's signature collection that works with alternative grains. So when you take a look at that resume and you see all that he has done, does Jerry Dalton deserve a place in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall-of-Fame?
I don't think there's any question about that. I mean, the way the hall basically operates is nominations come from the members of the KDA. I mean, and they typically are trying to promote their own brands and their own people, their own legacies, whatever it would be. And I don't think Jim Beam, Beam Suntory would have any objection to Jerry being nominated, and they would probably be receptive to nominating him. It may, maybe even be that just hadn't occurred to anybody.
He would be a perfect candidate for the Hall of Fame. You hit on all the aspects of what those members should be, making significant contributions to the industry, to the craft, to all things Kentucky bourbon. So I think Jerry has hit that on a number of points.
I think the answer is a yes, especially with that Johnny Appleseed criteria, where he impacted more than just the one distillery that he was most known for working at and helping other things. The knowledge and ways he grew Kentucky bourbon, yeah, Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame candidate for sure.
Yeah, I think he does. I mean, if you look at, people that are in the Hall of Fame today, which, is, a lot of, I'm a big fan of a lot of those folks. I think Jerry Dalton fits right within that crowd. He did a lot for, not just particular brand, but as the industry as a whole. And I think, that's what the Bourbon Hall of Fame really encompasses. It's, it's not what you did for, you were with this brand for 30 years or, it wasn't anything about that. It was like, okay, what did you do to elevate bourbon? What did you do to make it better as a whole? Did a lot of people benefit from the work that you did? And I think Jerry checks all those boxes.
Of course he does, a lot more than I did. First of all, he not only could talk it, he could make it work. And then the idea of adding to the history at Mount Vernon, a lot of people, I'm not saying that everybody would not do that, but that takes effort, commitment that you might want to use some other way, whether it's playing golf or going hunting or something. He was using his time to help put bourbon in a historical setting, so to speak, that he was going to put it far enough back that people realize it is an American spirit, and we're going to continue to make it and spread it all over the world.
I do, absolutely. And he contributed so much to our industry. And, you talk about experimental grains and things. Back then it wasn't heard of, especially someone the size of Jim Beam and the success Jim Beam had for so many years, and to go out and do something a little bit different. That took a lot of courage, and he was confident in what he was doing. And a lot of people are following suit today, using Indian corn, oats, 4-grain rather than the traditional 3-grain.
Yeah, you're seeing some brown rice out there. That was one he worked with. I mean, yeah.
That's amazing to do things like that. And but he was a real innovator, and for those reasons, I think the industry learned a lot from him, and I think he's well deserving of the honor of being inducted.
I would agree wholeheartedly, Steve, because his credentials speak for him for that. And, to know it and acknowledge it while he's still living is more meaningful, not only for him and his family, but for all those in the bourbon industry that are still, in the industry that are still trying to make it. And they can look up to somebody like Jerry Dalton with his credentials and say, yeah, he did it. He did it right. And I think this is an opportunity for all involved to give Jerry a push to the pinnacle of recognition.
Appreciate you, Jerry, everything that you've done, and so glad to be able to make this movie and tell your story.
Well, thank you.
Well, there you have it, a collection of industry leaders and contemporaries who all say Jerry Dalton deserves a place in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame. Hopefully, you also agree I've made the case as to why he belongs in the Hall. Now, it's out of our hands and up to the powers that be. Maybe something happens with this, and maybe it doesn't. I had one of our interviewees talk to me off the record. He felt like the omission of Jerry Dalton from the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame isn't something that was done because he doesn't deserve it, but Jim Beam was going through some major changes just as his career ended. Fortune Brands sold the company, and then Suntory became the owner, and you have restructuring going on behind the scenes to Beam Suntory, and then you had leadership under Beam Brands, Beam North America, etc. Jerry retires, and the people that truly were his advocates also begin retiring during this transition, and before you know it, we're at where we are today. While I hope Jerry can get this capstone to his career in bourbon, I do know that we've been able to show the story to you, and that's pretty important. Also, while I set out to make a bourbon movie, it also has a love story subplot for the true love of Jerry's life, his wife Judy, and their marriage and partnership through all of this. Judy worked with Jerry early in his career. She would go on to stand by his side with him at industry events. They raised 2 children together. At the end of her life, he stood by her as her caretaker as she slipped away from dementia. With the loss of his wife, we see how precious life is, and it sure would be nice to see him be able to bask in the glory of this recognition. Over the last several years, we've seen some individuals like Steve Thompson and Dr. Pierce Lyons receive posthumous recognition, but there isn't anything better than being able to be part of this recognition and experience it. If all that comes out of this movie is the recognition of the love story, well, that's okay by me. Whether or not the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame calls, Jerry and Judy Dalton are a Hall of Fame love story.